Over many years, Blizzard has introduced so many different systems, patches, updates, and changes to the World of Warcraft. Some of them have become defining features of the game that have been carried forward and well remembered by so many of us. Others are things that have been left behind and that we'd probably sooner forget. But what were the best features and what were the worst? Today I'm going to be covering what I feel was the worst feature of each of World of Warcraft's expansions so far. And yes, this will be fully in my own opinion, so I'm expecting people to agree or maybe disagree on some points. But with all that said, there's 10 expansions to get through and a lot of years of content. For me, these have to be the worst features in each World of Warcraft expansion. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor, Boot.dev. Boot.dev is a platform dedicated to teaching back-end web development from start to finish in the Python and Go programming languages. It keeps things fresh and interesting by treating this a learning experience like an RPG where you're in charge of the pace at which the action happens. It has achievements, leaderboards, daily goals, and much more. And above all, Boot.dev wants to get you hands-on writing and understanding your own code, as it's such an effective way to learn the content. There is plenty of help available for your learning journey too. For example, Boot has an AI tool to help you understand what you are learning rather than just handing you the answers if you do get stuck. And Boot.dev believe that getting a solid understanding of the fundamentals and taking your time is key in this field of work. And if eventually it proves to be something for you, it can be a well-paid field and often has remote working opportunities too. So why not check them out? You can click the link in the description box and use my code WILLE to get 25% off your first payment for Boot.dev. That's 25% your first month or your first year, depending on the subscription that you choose. Many thanks to Boot.dev for the continued support on the channel. Let's get on back to WoW. Starting from the start, of course, in Vanilla. It's difficult to look back to Vanilla now, having played it back in the day in 04 and 5, and then its re-release in Classic in 2019. And those two things are very, very different experiences. The worst feature of Vanilla originally was the fact that I still had to go to school and couldn't play the game all day. But really, how can I criticize a time so steeped in nostalgia? On its re-release in 2019 though, I do think Classic started to show that there were some decisions in the game that didn't quite hold up as well these days. So for the worst feature of Vanilla, I'm going to go on the artificial restrictions that are placed on the game by the developers. And what I mean by this are just numbers which can't go above certain points. Take for example the debuff cap in Vanilla. Originally you could only have 8 debuffs on a target at one time. There was of course 40-man raiding and one player could do half of those debuffs pretty easily, and I can only imagine back in the day it would have been an absolute mess of just people overriding each other's debuffs. In patch 1.7, around when ZG was released, they raised this debuff cap from 8 to 16. This did make things a bit more flexible, but really it was still the case that you were only allowed to apply debuffs which were benefiting the whole raid, such as Curse of Recklessness, Sunder Armor, and so on. Serpent Sting? Nope. Moonfire? Nope. Corruption as a warlock? Maybe if you're lucky. In future expansions they'd raise the debuff cap to where basically it wouldn't apply anymore, but I don't think it was the best feature in Vanilla. Along the lines of restrictions, there was also a buff cap where you could only have 32 buffs at one time. Sounds pretty excessive, but if you're fully buffed up using all the world buffs and consumables, you can reasonably hit that number whilst you're in a raid. And for example, if you were playing a restoration druid and you wanted to use rejuvenation on a warrior, you would actively be griefing them by giving them the possibility of removing more important buffs. That was the state of some classes in Vanilla. Again, a lot of buffs were consolidated and world buffs were removed in future expansions, so that wasn't a problem anymore. And the final restriction that's definitely worth a mention for Vanilla has to be spell batching. On Vanilla's re-release in 2019, Blizzard recreated this system where effectively spell inputs had up to a forced half a second delay. This did try to emulate how things were back in the day, but it just ended up being really scuffed. This spell batching window essentially meant that spells were dealt with in a group every half a second rather than being resolved as soon as possible. So what this meant is sometimes, for example, you could land a heal on a tank, you spend your mana, but the batching window hasn't occurred yet, so you lose all your mana and the tank dies anyway. I think it was an interesting idea to try it again. It just didn't work. The Burning Crusade. On we ventured through the dark portal into a mysterious alien world. This was back in the good old days of midnight releases and queuing outside your local local game store to pick up a copy. Things were very different back then, and they were different in the game as well. One of the most defining features of the Burning Crusade has to have been attunements. Now, I've gone on record a bunch of times and said, actually, I think attunements are pretty good, and I'll stand by that. They are pretty good. The first time. When you're going through them with your guild, you're seeing all the content through, you're getting a first look at the dungeons. It's a pretty satisfying ladder to have to climb. The problem comes along when you want to play an alt, or maybe even a character after that, because you need to go through this entire attunement process on each one. And the attunement process in TBC was long. The real simple way of explaining it is to get onto each new raid tier, you had to have completed the raid tier before that. And in TBC, people typically weren't going back to old raids as much as they were in vanilla, so when new people came along and tried to join your guild, it was often the case that you had to rerun them through this old content again and again to try and get them up to speed, only for inevitably the roster boss to hit, people quit, you need new recruits, and you just got this revolving door of trying to get people up this ladder to the point where they can raid where your guild's currently at. In time, Blizzard would dial these attunement requirements back a lot, and in future expansions they basically did away with this system entirely. So as interesting as attunements were the first time around, they just didn't hold up well long term. Wrath of the Lich King, we finally head to the frozen north to take on the infamous Arthas Menethil and the armies of the Scourge. What a hype moment that was. You know, before having replayed Wrath Classic, I might have even picked the looking for dungeon system here, but now having replayed the game with it, honestly, I don't particularly mind being matched with people for a dungeon. I'd still be fine with traveling there by myself, I don't think that's a big deal, but I think it's just worth it in terms of making the content more accessible. A lot of people would also look to Trial of the Grand Crusade as a rather lackluster raid, and again, after having replayed it, the raid was fine. Personally, I didn't like the RP between each boss, and I would have preferred some trash to kill rather than hearing about Wilfred Fizzlebang summoning Jiraxxus for the 1000th time. But the bosses were fairly interesting, it was short and sweet, it was rewarding on loot, and it was the first raid ever to have heroic mode as an optional toggle. So you know what, Trial of the Crusader, not that bad. I think if I'm picking for Wrath, it's gonna have to be something which is a bit of a cop-out and that I could have really picked for TBC Wrath or Cataclysm. But for me, I think this is the right thing to pick, and that'd be just the lack of content outside of raiding or PvP. Yes, Wrath did introduce achievements, there was a bunch of reputations and so on and so forth, they crammed in loads of daily quests as updates came in through the game, but there just wasn't that extra stuff to do with your character. Once the raid was done, if you wanted to do more, it was make another character and just go do the raid again. And it's not as though I'd want a system where we need to complete some task or we fall behind in character power. We know they did that in the future. But just something else I can throw my character at and, well, just a reason to play the game a bit more. I felt that was missing from Wrath. Onto Cataclysm and the Shattering, a controversial expansion, and that's still true by today's standards. And my pick for the worst feature of this expansion is the easiest one on this list so far. Say it with me, everyone. LFR. The goal of this was very noble. They wanted to get more people into raiding because raiding in World of Warcraft has consistently been a strong point and something that people around the world still enjoy to this day. But the execution on it was just really not good. Ghostcrawler even went on record during an AMA when he was at Riot saying that LFR was one of his biggest regrets at his time at Blizzard. The problem was that it created a revolving door of people joining and leaving a raid, hoping that you can bash your head into a boss hard enough for it to finally fall over and cough up some loot. And originally in Dragon Soul, which is when LFR was first introduced, it was very much worth doing, even for the top guilds in the world, because of how powerful the tier set bonuses were. In fact, both Paragon and Method at the time got a ban for exploiting an LFR, and it was also kind of difficult in its first iteration. Obviously, if you're in an organized raiding guild, you just walk over it and say, "What is this joke?" But for an unorganized pug group, this could be a real challenge. And you know what else LFR didn't have in Cataclysm? Determination stacks. The only thing that, well, determined whether you're gonna kill the boss was whether the people in your group understood it and were willing to put in the effort. And that's why LFR has to be my pick for Cataclysm. Onto a rather unexpected expansion now, where we head over to Pandaria to do battle with feelings, amongst other things. Pandaria is weird. Back in the day, people criticized it so much, and yet we look back now and think, damn, this was a pretty good expansion actually. So for me to pick its worst feature is a bit of a tricky one, to be honest. I could, for example, say there was a lot of daily content. I think people forget that about Mists of Pandaria. There truly was quite the list of stuff that needed to be checked off. Maybe Thunder Forging from the Throne of Thunder. I think that in many ways paved a lot of forging effects that we'd see in the future, where luck could increase the power of your gear dramatically. But it was still pretty tame in Mists of Pandaria, so I'll give that a pass. You know, if I have to pick one feature of Mists of Pandaria, it's probably one of the biggest additions that it's made to the game, and one that's still as visible today as it was when it's released. So for Mists of Pandaria, I'm picking Pandaren. Yep, the new race that was added in Mists of Pandaria is my choice, and I just think they don't really feel as though they fit in. They look fine in Pandaria when they're out on Half-Hill farming away, or laughing and eating together, but when you take them into the wider Warcraft universe, they just feel kind of goofy. In fact, there is one defining thing which has definitely pushed me towards picking Pandaren here. So at the start of Mists of Pandaria, I made a Pandaren monk. I imagine many of us did. I wanted to see the new zone, get a feel for them, and then take that new class into the expansion. And I never played a monk properly at endgame or got into PvP or raiding with them, but I'd always level it up all the same just to see how they played in each expansion. And I believe it was in Legion when I did a paid race change off of Pandaren just so I didn't have to look at it anymore. Again, I didn't race change for any endgame reasons or racials, but I just didn't like the character. So that's why for Pandaria, I'm picking the Pandaren. Following Mists of Pandaria, of course, we move onwards, or I guess back in time technically, to Warlords of Draenor. I guess this is an expansion where I'm spoilt for choice, and unfortunately, not in a good way. You know, the content that did exist in Warlords of Draenor was largely okay. Now, I'm kind of split on what I do want to pick, as admittedly what I want to say isn't necessarily a feature. I guess the easy choice is going to be garrisons. They completely messed up the expansion launch. Some people couldn't play for days on end, and then as it turned out, everything that we ever possibly needed ended up being available in our own instanced little world, complete with mission tables to go and have NPCs farm gold for us. Interesting idea, and perhaps the closest we're going to get to player housing in World of Warcraft for a long time, but it just panned out terribly. But ultimately, what I'm more disappointed with in Warlords of Draenor has to have been regarding all of the cut content. There is so much stuff that just didn't happen in this expansion. The Farallon zone to match where Burning Crusade's Neverstorm was. There was early concepts of a Zangarmarsh zone, and then they just flooded it and called it a day. Faction capitals were supposed to be in Frostfire Ridge for the Horde and the Temple of Caribou, aka the Black Temple for the Alliance. These were cancelled, and instead we had what felt like a temporary camp either side of Ashran. All the raiding content itself got released within the span of a year or so, and the final patch just went on and on. Perhaps worst of all, where's the dance studio, Blizzard? So I know it's not technically a feature of the expansion, but just the amount of stuff that we didn't end up getting has to be my choice for Warlords of Draenor. But then we get to Legion and everything's lovely again. Wonderful. There's so much to like about this expansion, but admittedly early on into it, it did very much have its problems, and my choice has to be with Legendary RNG. Legendaries are a huge feature in Legion, and they could alter your character's power by a pretty enormous degree. Not only that, but there were so many different legendaries you could get, and your character's chance of getting the first one or two was greatly improved. After that, you better hope and pray to see future legendaries, so it was really important that you got a good first legendary. People doing Race to World first would level multiple characters just to see what legendary they got. If you hit a bad one, that's too bad, reroll time. In time, Blizzard will make it a bit more lenient on legendary RNG, and then right towards the end of the expansion they introduced a currency where you could create legendaries. But early game Legion was definitely not without its problems, and I think early game legendary acquisition was the worst part of the expansion. And then we get to Battle for Azeroth. Much like Warlords of Draenor, I'm spoiled for choice, and not in a good way. There's definitely a few contenders here between Warfronts, what I took to be a PvP related piece of content which was kind kind of an auto-complete PvE event, bizarrely, needing to do islands which was running around the circle, and at least on the harder difficulties, trying to avoid everything from one-shotting you. But I think overall it has to have been Blizzard's bombardment of daily, weekly, and even monthly tasks that your character needed to do to stay up to power, both with the Azerite armor and the Heart of Azeroth. Lessons would be taken from this expansion in the future, and they were hard-learned ones at that. It was an expansion with its good points too, but as for its worst one, it has to have been the character upkeep. And then we get the 1-2 punch after BFA in the Shadowlands, and oh dear, unfortunately things aren't getting better just yet. Again, it's an expansion with several contenders. How about the more early on where you just had to run around on foot for ages? Perhaps Torghast, which was advertised as a roguelike feature within World of Warcraft that ended up being very tame and having a lot of overly simple bonuses. Maybe Covenants, where going into the expansion we were assured that if things weren't working out and people weren't able to make a meaningful choice, that the ripcord could be pulled and Blizzard will be able to sort it out, which just turned out not to be true. All of these will be a great pick, but I'm gonna have to go for something else, and the thing I'm gonna pick from Shadowlands is gonna be the story. I'm not even a big lore guy within World of Warcraft. On my first playthrough through a new expansion, I'll take my time, I'll watch the cutscenes, I'll get involved with the story. I'm not looking to rush towards endgame, complete content like it's a checklist and log out as soon as possible. I've been there, I've done that. I'm not doing that these days. But the story was just bizarre. I don't think there's another better way to put it. This jailer character who had just popped up in this expansion had been secretly influencing everything in the background right from the start of Warcraft. And then he refuses to elaborate on this and then dies at the end of the expansion and says, yeah, well, wait and see, there's something worse than this coming. We had the all-powerful Sylvanas who had been built up since BFA, and I think people are a little bit tired of her, and it was just a bizarre retcon of so many years of lore and story within the game. And I think moving past Shadowlands, we just kinda need to sweep that one under the rug. We can double retcon it. Shadowlands was definitely a low point for a lot of people, but the story has to have been my pick here. And then we move on to Dragonflight, our expansion that we've just come to the end of, and one that was very well received after a rather rough few years at Blizzard headquarters. And out of everything in Dragonflight, my pick here is actually really easy. And for me, the worst feature of this expansion was, hey, it's like I'm in Mr. Pandaria again, because I'm gonna pick the new race, Drakthea. I think they're really underwhelming model-wise. When people saw a dragon race, they thought back to the hulking draconids that you get in Blackwing Lair in earlier versions of the game. I mean, if there was an option to have a skinnier one and then a bulkier one, it would have been fine, but there is no option. You're just some salamander-looking boy. On top of that, it's like Blizzard just forgot about how many years they've gone through trying to make druids' forms look cool and customizable, because when you enter combat as a Drakthea, you're forced into your dragon form where you can't even see your armor. Imagine being the guy who has to make tier sets for Drakthea knowing that they're never going to see them in the first place. For an expansion where so many things were done right, it just seems like they missed the mark thematically on this new race. As far as I know, in the War Within you can stay in combat in your Visage form, and maybe even one day they'll open up other races to becoming evokers. If they do, that's an easy paid race change for me, by the way, Blizzard, I'm just telling you. But for Dragonflight, it has to be Drakthea. And finally, the War Within. Yeah, we're super early on into the expansion. I know we haven't seen the full content by any means, but I guess that's where we are at the moment, and I thought, you know what, I'm gonna throw something here in the video just as some early thoughts on the expansion. And my pick for the War Within so far has to be underground zones. So there's two that I'm thinking of in particular. Okay, yes, there are 3 underground zones technically in the War Within, but Hallowfall just doesn't feel like you're underground because the skybox is absolutely enormous and you've got the big lava lamp looking thing in the sky anyway to keep the lights on and make things feel a bit more bright and vibrant. But Ashkahet and the Ringing Deeps, yeah, not so keen on them. The thing is with underground zones is nowadays we have dragon riding, or sky riding I suppose, and this form of flight is just so fast and agile that when you're underground there's all these pillars everywhere in the way, you can't necessarily go over things, and it just feels a bit cramped for how quickly we can move around the map now. If you look at how Blizzard designed Dragonflight with its huge wide open zones with all these wonderful skyboxes and vistas, you can really tell how they played into that. And yes, there was the Zaralite Caverns in Dragonflight of course, and I pretty much have the same comment for that. It just felt a bit cramped when we're so agile nowadays. but for the War Within, my pick is going to be Underground Zones. And hopefully that is the worst thing I have to say about it, though we'll see if any more get added in the future, you never know. But that's it, what I feel as though was the worst feature of every single version of World of Warcraft so far. Let me know what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Was there anything completely different that you would have picked? Drop it down in the comments down below. Oh, and I'm already planning on doing the opposite version of this video where I go over my favourite thing in each expansion, so look out for that one pretty soon. But, as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.